The terrified faces of the North Koreans were captured by the drone cameras. In the midst of the terror in that open field, some of them gave in to despair. A soldier pointed his cape at the drone, trying to bring it down before he was hit. It was yet another attack in which those faces, deformed by fear, were captured in images of the conflict that, for the 5th month now, had been spreading into Russia. Moscow used different strategies to drive the Ukrainians from their land. Their snipers camouflaged themselves and adjusted their scopes to shoot at opponents in the trenches. The Ka-52 helicopters flew by, firing their rockets. Winter was beginning in Kursk, but it seemed that the fighting was far from over. The presence of North Koreans in Russia, more precisely in Kursk, fighting against the Ukrainian invasion of the Russian oblast, sparked heated discussions. Kiev's absolute belief in the presence of these troops was countered by Moscow's irony, silence, or denials. The Ukrainians gathered evidence from battles starting in November 2024, accumulating more data in December and then in January of the following year. The diary of one of the North Korean soldiers, a sergeant, was collected by Ukrainian special forces, revealing part of the motivations of these troops. Even with the data provided by the Ukrainians, there was still a lot of skepticism. The images of soldiers with East Asian features could easily be of Russians from one of the minority republics like Yakutia or Tuva. The passports found on the bodies of the supposed North Korean soldiers were forgeries, according to Kyiv. The military identification documents did not contain the required stamps and photos. They showed patronymic names in the Russian format and listed the place of birth as the Republic of Tuva, a Russian region located in southern Siberia near the border with Mongolia. Gradually, the number of casualties increased among the soldiers identified by Kyiv as North Koreans. The extremely violent fighting in the conflict, combined with the strategies in Kursk, resulted in deaths and injuries among the approximately 11,000 to 12,000 soldiers sent by Pyongyang. Many ended up in hospitals in Kursk. There was information that they were taken to a floor reserved exclusively for them, protected by police officers, where only translators and healthcare professionals were allowed to enter. The battles in which these injuries occurred were fought against different Ukrainian troops, among them the 8th Separate Special Purpose Regiment. The regiment was under the command of Ukraine's Special Operations Forces, one of the 8 branches of the country's armed forces. In an interview, one of its operators praised the North Korean soldiers. His description was of a highly skilled, disciplined, fearless, and motivated infantry made up mostly of very young men. Later, the Pentagon made a similar statement, most likely based on reports from the Ukrainians. This information may seem confusing when many claim that they would desert or would just be poorly trained soldiers used as cannon fodder. The truth was a mix of many of these aspects. The Russians were using different strategies to try to drive the Ukrainians out of Kursk. Their snipers positioned themselves along the tree lines after the drones found the Ukrainian positions. These men, by the way, had a phenotype similar to that of North Koreans. The features of these soldiers from minority ethnic groups in the Russian Federation were part of the argument that there were no North Koreans in Kursk. The sniper stopped next to his companion. He adjusted his aim, making the calculations for a precise shot at the Ukrainian hundreds of meters away. The shot took the man down. The Russian kamikaze drones searched for the Ukrainians that the snipers couldn't eliminate in those positions. The explosion in the middle of the trees destroyed part of the shelters. Sometimes it took more than one hit when an armored vehicle was found camouflaged among the enemy defenses. Persistence paid off. After all, the destroyed equipment was hundreds of times more expensive than all the kamikazes used to destroy it. The Russians still had even more to send against the Ukrainians. The northern Ukrainians gathered along the tree line. They were a large group, maybe 30 or more soldiers. Under the lenses of special cameras, their bodies glowed as they gathered. It took them a while to get organized, but they finally began their first steps through the snow to attack the positions of the 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade of Ukraine. A bombardment hastened the soldiers' movement, putting them into a quick march. The boots of the North Koreans dragged through the thick snow of the Kursk plains. Marching in the Russian winter was not easy at all. They spread out across the field. It was exhausting to cross the long distance until they reached the Ukrainian positions. That attack was stopped by the fall of artillery shells. The cluster munitions were deadly killers, exploding among so many people and sending their fragments into the soldiers' bodies. The North Korean march was halted by heavy casualties, forcing some of the men to retreat. Inside the tree line, it was hard to find cover. The men looked up, revealing their Asian features, which sparked as much controversy as their identity. From above, the drone attack began, dropping grenades on their victims who ran in terror. Some of the soldiers were struck by the deadly kamikaze drones. The Ukrainians once again filmed the bodies, showing lines of them slowly being covered by snow. There was no real proof that these troops were North Korean, but Kyiv stuck to its version based on documents, facial features, and combat style. The drones from the 95th Air Assault Brigade stopped another one of their platoons in the fields of Kursk. The North Koreans were tenacious with their dog-like loyalty to their regime, but they were not prepared for that conflict. Their advances seemed like they were from another war, not the one that Russians and Ukrainians have been fighting for 3 years, a war the whole world has watched, seeing the destruction caused by drones and artillery on any large group that gathers. The drones took those lives, leaving more bodies to be covered and preserved by the snow. Those men looked like they belonged to the assault corps of the North Korean armed forces. They were trained to infiltrate dense vegetation, but in that war, the Russians and Ukrainians were well aware of that strategy. The Russians had developed tactics to advance on the Ukrainians using tree lines and small armed groups. The North Koreans, on the other hand, moved in large groups, sometimes bunching together and becoming perfect targets for drones like Baba Yaga. This Ukrainian hexacopter was one of the terrors of the war. Its mortar-sized munitions rained down on groups of North Koreans, breaking up their formations and leaving little more than pieces of their corpses scattered among the trees. Smaller drones hovered over fallen men in the field, already exhausted from running away. Lying near the bodies of their comrades and artillery marks, 2 of them received the explosive just a few meters away. It was enough for the shrapnel to pierce their uniforms and embed itself in their flesh. While one struggled, the other looked up with a resigned expression, waiting for another attack. Many of the records of North Koreans made by the Ukrainians were in Peklovro to the south, from where Kyiv's forces were expelled in December. They also appeared further north, near Kluzhenko. Kluzhenko was in a contested region where fighting had been going on for over a month. In early November, Russian planes carried out their attacks on the village. 3-ton bombs were dropped by Moscow's Air Force. The FAB-3000 glided to various positions, detonating along the tree lines. Lives were ended in these attacks. The 155th Marine Brigade of the Pacific Fleet sent mechanical swarms to neutralize the movements of the Ukrainian armored vehicles. Many FPVs dove onto the rear of Kyiv. The Russians destroyed a Ukrainian T-64 tank near the tree line, very close to the village, back in December. The drones from the 155th continued to terrorize the Ukrainians. Now it was the turn of the Lancers, who were very useful for destroying armored vehicles with a single strike, like the case of the BMP UMPS that was also hit near a tree line. AFAB Mil 1500 was launched against the Ukrainian positions identified after the North Koreans exposed them in one of their attacks. These bombings destroyed many of the houses and buildings where the Ukrainians were taking cover, forcing Kiev's soldiers to move between new hiding places. By exposing themselves, they became targets for Russian drones. The Russians increased their offensive against the Ukrainians. A mechanized assault by the 155 aimed to quickly seize the defenses already ruined by the powerful bombardment. The strikes from the artillery and air force had already spread through Kruzhenko, fragmenting the village's defenses. The Ukrainians had to run as their only way to escape Russian punishment. It was hard to escape so much torment. That's why the 155th issued orders for the mechanized assault to begin. The BTR rolled across the field, firing the Krupnokaliberny Pulemyot Vladimirova machine gun. It tried to avoid an armored vehicle destroyed in a previous attack. One of its wheels triggered a mine, covering it with the smoke of destruction. The next vehicle also exploded. There was so much smoke that the Ukrainian drone's lens could barely detect the other armored vehicles firing further back. They met the same fate in the minefield in front of the tree line. The armored vehicles that managed to get close to the village were blown up by the drones. None of them were left to continue the attack. The remains of men and machines were left in the fields, bearing witness to more slaughter on the plains of Kursk. Another attack, carried out a little later, was interrupted by a succession of drone dives and the use of anti-tank missiles, resulting in yet another Russian failure at Kujenko. The North Koreans were put into action at some point between these attacks. Unlike the Russians, they did not proceed with armored vehicles. Most of them marched across the fields when the snow was already covering the ground. They moved near the trees, under the watchful eyes of Ukraine's 17th Brigade and probably under orders from Russia's 155th. They were caught off guard by rifle fire. They tried to fight back, but they were too exposed. There was no need for an order to retreat, but simply turning their backs on the enemy was a mistake. They offered themselves to the embrace of death. Some managed to escape this ambush, but the drones were alert, ready to start the hunt against such plentiful groups of targets. The artillery was called in to finish the job. In the end, the Ukrainians filmed another row of bodies in the snow, claiming they were North Koreans. They wondered how the orders for those strange advances were given, and if there was some communication problem between the Russians and North Koreans that allowed those absurdities to keep happening. The fierce fighting continued. The troops from Pyongyang arrived in large numbers. Despite the casualties, they were taking control of the wooded areas around Kujinko. The high-mobility artillery rocket system launched their attack against this new offensive. The cluster munitions exploded against another large group of North Koreans. The attack was repelled, but the use of high-mobility artillery rocket systems showed just how difficult it was to deal with so many waves. It had already been 3 days of successive attacks. In mid-December, Ukraine's 95th Brigade filmed more squads from North Korea marching in the snow. Once again, that was not a mechanized attack. Men walked in the open field, a repetition of waves that had been tormenting the Ukrainians. As if under a curse, the drones appeared, dropping death on the soldiers. The explosions forced the North Koreans to retreat, suffering more fire, but they kept coming back. They were filling the areas where there were still trees standing. The Ukrainians detected them and launched more drones against them. Their bodies were left lying in the snow for another day. Others found new positions, setting up camp to continue their attacks near a tree line. The kamikazes worked over them, ending another day. But the next morning, the North Koreans were already there again. A group of Ukrainian infantry was about to be surrounded, with at least one wounded. The special forces entered the fight. Soldiers from the 73rd Naval Special Operations Center took position with a Mark 19 ready to intercept the enemy troops. The American weapon could launch more than 40 grenades per minute with an effective range of up to 1.5 kilometers. The explosions erupted in sequence along the tree line, throwing men to the ground. Lives were ended when the shots landed directly on those less fortunate. The Special Forces drones flew over the mass of wounded North Koreans. There could be no peace. Mercy was not an option in that case. The grenades made their way until they exploded over the soldiers. They rolled, tried to escape, but the Ukrainians chased them. In the end, the Ukrainians from the 73 Special Forces even helped evacuate one of the infantrymen wounded by the North Koreans. The Russians did their job when they realized how weakened the Ukrainians already were in some areas. A Boyevaya Mashina Desanta 4, a light infantry vehicle, aimed its 7100mm cannon to break through the Ukrainian lines. Next to it was a T-80 tank, whose thunderous blasts made enemy lives tremble along with the trees. There were few images of this Russian offensive in Krujinko, but the Russians recorded the bombs falling on the village once again. The North Koreans also continued occupying positions, then left them once the Russian forces took over the captured area. Then Pyongyang's forces picked up their rifles and moved on to new battles with the Ukrainians. The speculation about the few videos released by the Russians during these conquests in Kursk, an important event for their armed forces, was the fact that they did not want to film the North Koreans. But it's important to remember that there were areas in Donetsk with few videos as well. Krujinko fell at the end of December. After that, the Ukrainians had to retreat even further. The 10th Heavy Mechanized Brigade of Ukraine tried to stop the ostentatious Russian advance with drones. The special cameras spotted the small groups of Moscow's Marine squads sneaking between the trees. The rain of grenades was effective, but the Russians knew how to spread out. They had to hunt down Moscow's soldiers one by one among the trees, taking more time than simply dropping grenades on gathered North Koreans. The soldiers from Pyongyang were greeted by Ukrainian drones near Dikujimpo as they tried to extend Russian control. The 2nd Battalion of the 22nd Mechanized Brigade managed to take advantage of their numbers gathered together to launch an explosive that wounded several with shrapnel. Grenades or rocket-propelled grenade rounds were dropped by these drones. The small 3D-printed fins gave accuracy to the drop. Even when they didn't hit directly, their shrapnel flew for meters, penetrating the skin and hiding in the flesh. Wounded by these fragments, the North Koreans sought the trees. They were the only protection where they leaned, trying to regain their strength. Fragments and soft tissue could become infected if not removed early. Others could be in more sensitive areas, causing severe internal bleeding or tearing muscles and organs when the soldier moved. Kamikaze drones took over the sky above these men. Their discouraged looks saw the threat. The risk wasn't enough to make them move. Their bodies only flinched reflexively at the impacts. The bodies remained there until the Ukrainians sent in infantry to gather information about the enemy. They found only passports issued in mid-2024 without identification photos. Not every soldier stood still in the face of the kamikaze threat. They tried to fight back, shooting at the virus as it grew more threatening and increased in size as the drone approached. The CAR fired ammunition to hit a small moving object while adrenaline-filled arms tried to stay steady in the face of mortal danger. But it was no use. Often it just meant standing still and becoming an easy target for the drone. There was no shortage of targets during these North Korean advances. They ran, fired, and fell in desperation, only able to wait for a deadly impact while still kneeling before that demon. The drones were predators, hunting the slowest and most distracted in the lines. Those on the ground were not spared. The machines flew between the ranks, passing through the hail of ammunition with their evil sound. The drone spun in the air, turning around as it sniffed out the panic spreading among the soldiers. It savored this wickedness of war as it descended to finish off more of these men. They could run, but looking back only made them slower in the face of death. Some resigned themselves, kneeling in the snow, saying their final goodbyes. A man stumbled while shooting, tried to get up, but the rifle kissed the drone that exploded in front of his face. The airborne plague could make a precise attack, exploding on a soldier's head. The desperation to try to shoot and look up threw the soldier off balance. From the ground, he saw death. They exploded in groups, filling the flesh of several soldiers with fragments. Many of these soldiers arrived in transports that were hunted by the same kamikazes from the 8th Special Purposes Regiment. Many of these vehicles were not armored, which made them very susceptible to explosions. Before they could drop off the Ukrainians for another wave, they became piles of burning metal on the side of the roads. Some drones were positioned in ambushes, saving energy until a target passed by. The demon took flight and gave chase until it hit the Russian vehicle. The special forces of the 8th Regiment managed to stop some North Korean and Russian attacks during that difficult winter for the Ukrainians in Kursk. Those were complicated days, trying to withstand the winter offensive planned by Moscow. No matter how much footage the Ukrainians took of failed attacks on the enemies, the truth was that they had been taking back a good part of the territory through their persistence. It was a strong advance at first, but the pace slowed down after December, when the cold got even worse. The fact was that in January 2025, the Ukrainians had already been in Kursk for 6 months, inside the territory of the world's second-largest army and one of the most experienced in war. Holding on to these lands was important for future negotiations, but until then, there would be a lot of blood from at least 3 nations fertilizing the soil of the Russian heartland.